When life rises against you, when enemies conspire in the dark, when lies are spoken louder than truth, and when the weight of injustice tries to break your spirit, there comes a moment where you don't have to fight with your fists, your tongue, or your own strength. There comes a moment where silence becomes your greatest weapon, because silence testifies that you trust a God who sees, who hears, and who defends. You don't have to prove yourself to everyone, because the one who called you already knows who you are. The battle is not yours. It belongs to the Lord. The problem with many of us is we think if we don't speak up, if we don't fight back, we'll lose. We think our reputation, our dignity, our worth will collapse if we don't set the record straight. But let me tell you something. When you stay silent in obedience to God, you are not weak. You are declaring that God is stronger than your words. You are declaring that God's justice will outlast the lies, that His power will silence the voices against you. Your silence isn't defeat. It's faith in action. When the Israelites stood at the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army behind them, they didn't have a plan, they didn't have weapons, they didn't have escape routes. Fear shouted at them, but God told them to stand still and watch Him fight. And when God fights for you, no army, no slander, no storm can win. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is be still and watch heaven move on your behalf. Now let me give you some keys to hold on to. First, silence is not absence, it is presence. When you are silent, God has room to step in and take center stage. Second, silence is not weakness. It is strength under control, strength that trusts in God's timing. Third, silence is not giving up. It is positioning yourself for divine vindication. Fourth, silence is not fear. It is confidence that God's justice will prevail. Fifth, silence is not ignorance. It is wisdom to let God handle what your hands cannot. Sixth, silence is not defeat. It is victory that's still unfolding. And seventh, silence is not emptiness. It is filled with faith that heaven is at work behind the scenes. There are moments when God says, "Be still and know that I am God." Not argue and prove yourself. Not defend and fight. But be still, because in your stillness, His strength is revealed. In your silence, His voice is magnified. And in your surrender, His power becomes undeniable. So, the next time you are tempted to clap back, to defend yourself with anger, to fight battles in your own strength, pause and remember, silence doesn't mean you're losing. Silence means God is defending you in ways your voice never could. He is your shield, your defender, your strong tower. Let your silence speak of your faith. Because when you stay silent, God defends you. And when God defends you, victory is certain. Silence is not absence, it is presence. Too often, when we think about silence, we imagine emptiness. We imagine nothingness, a void, a place where words are missing and power is absent. But in God's kingdom, silence is never empty. Silence is not the sound of defeat, but the sound of God stepping in. When you hold your peace, you are not abandoning the fight. You are inviting the Almighty into it. Silence is a stage, and when you step back from the spotlight, it gives God room to step forward. Sometimes He doesn't need your words. He needs your stillness. Sometimes He doesn't need your defense. He needs your trust. Silence becomes a divine declaration that you believe God is present even when you're not speaking. Think about Jesus before His accusers. He could have spoken a word to silence their lies. He could have defended Himself with wisdom. He could have shut every mouth with undeniable truth. Yet, He stood silent before them. That silence wasn't weakness. It was the strength of heaven standing tall in the face of human judgment. That silence was presence, God's presence on display. It was not the absence of words. It was the fullness of purpose. Sometimes your silence is the loudest sermon you can ever preach. It says, "I don't have to fight because I know who fights for me. I don't have to argue because I know who justifies me. I don't have to respond because God's presence is already speaking louder than my words ever could." Many people misunderstand silence. They think if you are quiet, you are powerless. They think if you don't clap back, you are weak. But silence is often the greatest evidence of confidence. When you know who walks with you, you don't have to prove anything. When you know the God who created the heavens and the earth is standing by your side, you don't waste your breath trying to prove yourself to people who could never define you in the first place. Silence says, "My God is here, and I trust Him to show Himself mighty." Silence says, "I don't need to panic because His presence surrounds me like a shield." There are times when silence becomes a spiritual weapon. The enemy thrives on noise, on chaos, on accusations, on stirring conflict. But when you are silent, you starve his strategy. When you are silent, you remove the fuel from his fire. And in that silence, God's presence begins to rise. Remember the story of Joshua leading Israel around the walls of Jericho. God commanded them to march in silence for 6 days. Imagine the enemy soldiers mocking them, laughing at their quiet march, ridiculing their lack of weapons or noise. Yet, what they didn't realize was that silence wasn't absence. It was the presence of obedience, the presence of faith, the presence of God working behind the scenes. On the 7th day, when the shout came, the walls fell, because the silence had prepared the ground for God's presence to bring victory. Silence is not you being left alone. Silence is God saying, "Step aside and let me take this." Sometimes the best way to see the hand of God move is to take your hand off the situation. Sometimes the best way to hear his voice is to stop adding your own noise. Silence positions you to notice his nearness. When you are silent, you begin to sense his peace, his guidance, his whispers of assurance. Silence creates room for God to reveal that he was there all along, fighting battles you couldn't see, rearranging circumstances you didn't know about, and protecting you from attacks you didn't even recognize. We live in a culture that celebrates loudness. Everyone wants to be heard. Everyone wants to defend their image. Everyone wants to win arguments and prove themselves right. But when you choose silence, you step out of the culture of noise and step into the culture of God's presence. You declare that you don't have to join the shouting match of the world because you already have the attention of heaven. You don't have to win arguments because you've already won favor with the one whose opinion is eternal. You don't have to justify yourself because your defender never slumbers or sleeps. Sometimes silence is harder than speaking. It takes discipline to hold your tongue when lies are being spoken against you. It takes faith to remain calm when your reputation is being torn down. It takes trust to resist the urge to explain yourself when others misunderstand you. But in that silence, God is near. In that silence, his spirit whispers, "I've got you. I am present. I am defending you." And when God is present, no absence of words can take away your victory. Silence is not absence. It is the manifestation of divine presence in your situation. When you keep quiet, you are not alone. You are surrounded. When you refuse to fight in your flesh, you are declaring that the God of heaven is still active, still watching, still orchestrating everything for your good. Silence is faith in its purest form. Faith that doesn't need noise to prove its confidence. Faith that doesn't need arguments to validate its truth. Faith that rests in the quiet assurance that God is present and God is enough. Silence is not weakness. It is strength under control. One of the greatest misconceptions people carry is that if you don't respond, if you don't defend yourself, if you don't fight back with words or actions, you're somehow fragile or powerless. But real strength is not proven by how loud you can shout or how quickly you can retaliate. Real strength is proven by your ability to restrain yourself when everything in you wants to lash out. Silence is a demonstration of spiritual maturity because it reveals that you are not driven by emotion but by faith. It is easy to scream when you're attacked. It is easy to argue when you're misunderstood. It is easy to strike back when someone hurts you. But it takes extraordinary strength to remain still, to remain calm, to remain silent, because silence requires trust that God is stronger than your need to respond. Strength under control is the essence of silence. Think of a lion resting under a tree. The lion doesn't roar every time a bird passes by. It doesn't fight every small animal in its path. Why? Because the lion knows who it is. The lion doesn't need to prove its power. Its presence alone carries authority. That's what silence does for a believer. When you stay quiet in the face of provocation, you are declaring, "I know who I am, I know whose I am, and I don't need to prove anything to anyone." Silence is not weakness. It is the roar of confidence held back, waiting on God's timing to reveal itself. Look at Jesus on the cross. Soldiers mocked him. Leaders insulted him. People spat on him. Yet he remained silent through it all. If silence were weakness, he would have opened his mouth and called down angels to rescue him. If silence were weakness, he would have defended himself against false accusations. But in his silence, the strength of his mission was revealed. He stayed quiet not because he couldn't speak, but because he was strong enough to endure what was necessary for victory. Silence doesn't mean you lack strength. It means you have enough strength to keep it under control until the right moment. When we think of battles in life, we often picture noise, confrontation, debates, arguments, and struggles. But some of the most powerful victories are won in silence. When you choose not to respond to gossip, when you refuse to fight back against lies, when you hold your peace instead of exploding in anger, you are proving that your strength is anchored in God. You are saying, I don't have to waste my strength on petty battles because my God fights the ones that matter. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. That's not fragility. That's faith. It's far harder to walk away in silence than to stay and argue. It's far harder to pray instead of fight. It's far harder to trust God's timing instead of forcing your own. And it takes greater strength to trust God with the outcome than to try to manipulate the process yourself. Silence also protects you from regret. Words spoken in anger can never be taken back. Actions made in haste can create scars that last a lifetime. But when you choose silence, you choose self-control. Silence gives you time to think, time to breathe, time to let the Spirit guide you instead of your emotions driving you. And in that restraint, you display strength that outlasts the moment. People may call it weakness, but heaven calls it maturity. Heaven calls it faith in action. Heaven calls it strength that is greater than fists or words, because it is strength that has surrendered to God. The world may never understand this kind of strength, because culture celebrates reaction. Society teaches us to clap back, to always have the last word, to always defend ourselves no matter the cost. But silence breaks that cycle. Silence proves that you are not mastered by people's opinions, that you are not controlled by the need to be understood, and that you are not enslaved to the attacks of others. Silence says, I choose God's voice over the noise of the world. And that is true strength, strength that resists the urge to prove something to people, because your identity is already secured in God. Strength under control is not the absence of power, it is the mastery of power. A river flowing wildly can cause destruction, but that same river harnessed and channeled can generate electricity and sustain life. In the same way, your silence channels your strength toward God's purposes. Instead of wasting it on defending yourself, you invest it in trusting Him. Instead of using it to fight back against people, you allow Him to use it to shape you, refine you, and prepare you for the greater victories ahead. When you are silent, you are not weak. You are saying, I'm strong enough to trust God when my flesh wants to fight. I'm strong enough to wait when my emotions want to rush. I'm strong enough to endure when my pride wants to prove itself. That is strength under control. And that is the kind of strength that wins battles in ways words never could. Silence is not giving up. It is positioning yourself for divine vindication. There is a vast difference between surrendering to defeat and surrendering to God. Many people confuse silence with quitting, as though your refusal to fight back means you've accepted loss. But silence in faith is not resignation, it is elevation. It is choosing to step out of the way so God can step in. When you keep silent, you are not throwing in the towel. You are laying the matter at the feet of the one who never loses a case. Silence is not giving up on victory. It is giving victory back to the one who guarantees it. When you choose silence in the face of adversity, you are declaring that your hope does not rest in human approval or human justice. You are refusing to engage in a war that God has already promised to win for you. Think about the children of Israel standing at the edge of the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army pressing behind them. From a human perspective, it looked like defeat. They had no weapons, no way forward, and no way out. Yet God told them to stand still and watch Him fight. Their silence wasn't surrender to Pharaoh. It was positioning themselves to witness the vindication of God. And when the waters parted and Pharaoh's army drowned, it was proof that silence had paved the way for divine deliverance. Quitting says, I'm done because I can't win. Silence says, I'm waiting because I know God will win. Quitting is hopelessness, but silence is confidence. It takes far greater faith to keep quiet than to storm out. It takes deeper trust to refrain from defending yourself when accusations rise. It takes stronger conviction to remain silent when your name is being dragged, because silence testifies that you believe God Himself will rise and defend your name better than you ever could. Sometimes vindication doesn't come immediately. That's why silence is so difficult. We want quick justice, immediate explanations, instant answers. But God often works in ways that require patience, because He's not just proving something to your enemies. He's proving something in you. He's strengthening your endurance, deepening your faith, and shaping your character. Silence is not giving up the fight. It's submitting the fight to a higher court, where the judge of all the earth rules with perfect wisdom. And when He rules, no opposition can overturn His verdict. Take the example of Joseph. betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, lied on by Potiphar's wife, and forgotten in prison, he had every reason to argue, defend himself, and try to force justice on his own terms. But Joseph remained faithful in silence, doing what was right even when others did wrong. And in due time, the same silence that looked like defeat positioned him to be elevated to the palace. When God vindicated Joseph, it was clear that his silence was not giving up, but preparing for a greater destiny. Silence is powerful because it shifts the battle from your hands to God's hands. Every time you choose not to retaliate, every time you resist the urge to argue, every time you refrain from defending yourself with anger, you are transferring the weight of the conflict into the hands of the Almighty. That is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is not quitting. It is trusting. And in that transfer, God does what you could never do. He softens hearts, exposes lies, silences critics, and opens doors no man can shut. The beauty of divine vindication is that it always comes with clarity. When God vindicates you, there is no doubt who was behind your victory. If you fight for yourself, the credit belongs to you. But when you stay silent and let God fight, the glory belongs to Him alone. And when God gets the glory, the victory is sweeter, stronger, and more secure. That's why silence is not giving up. It's aligning yourself with the only one whose victory lasts forever. Some may mock your silence. They may call you weak, passive, or foolish. But let them talk, because silence is not for them. It is for Him. Your silence is a declaration that you are not living for the applause of men, but for the approval of God. You are not chasing validation from people. You are resting in vindication from heaven. And when heaven speaks, its voice drowns out every accusation. So when you are tempted to confuse silence with surrender, remember this. You are not giving up. You are getting in position. You are stepping back so God can step forward. You are quieting your voice so His can be heard louder. You are refusing to fight in the flesh so that He can fight in the spirit. Silence doesn't mean you've lost. It means you are letting God prepare the victory on your behalf. And when that victory comes, it will be undeniable, unstoppable, and unforgettable. Silence is not fear. It is confidence that God's justice will prevail. Fear causes panic, noise, and restless movement. Fear makes you feel like you must rush into action, defend yourself, or prove your strength because you're terrified of what others might think or what might happen if you don't act. But silence is the opposite of fear. It is standing still with a calm assurance that the Judge of heaven and earth sees everything and will set everything right in His time. Silence is not a shaky retreat into hiding. It is the bold stance of someone who knows their defender never loses. When people misunderstand you, when lies spread like wildfire, when you feel the sting of betrayal or the weight of injustice, fear tells you to fight with your own voice. Fear whispers, if you don't say something now, you'll be destroyed. Fear screams, you have to defend yourself or you'll lose everything. But faith silences fear and says, I don't need to fight for myself because God is already on the battlefield. I don't need to raise my voice because heaven is already speaking louder than any accusation. Silence rooted in faith is a declaration that you trust God's justice more than your own defense. Consider Daniel in the lion's den. He didn't argue with the king, didn't fight against the decree, didn't scream for his innocence. He simply trusted God and kept his peace. That silence wasn't fear of men. It was confidence in God. And when the lions could not touch him, the whole nation saw that God's justice prevailed. His silence testified louder than any defense he could have given. Fear would have made him beg or argue, but faith allowed him to rest in silence, knowing that God would vindicate him. We must understand that God's justice is not always immediate, but it is always perfect. Fear comes from impatience. It tells you that if justice doesn't show up now, it will never come. But silence says, I can wait because God is never late. Silence is the calm assurance that even if the world takes time to recognize the truth, God has already seen it and His justice is certain. The quietness of faith doesn't come from ignoring reality, but from trusting a higher reality. The reality that God sits on the throne and rules with perfect judgment. Silence also reveals where your confidence truly lies. If your confidence is in yourself, you will feel compelled to speak, to argue, to defend, to fight every battle in your own strength. But if your confidence is in God, you can hold your peace because you know He will fight for you. That kind of silence is not the sound of fear. It's the sound of bold faith. It is like standing in the middle of a storm without panicking because you know the one who controls the winds and waves is in the boat with you. Your silence becomes your testimony that your confidence is unshakable. Job is another example of this kind of confidence. He endured suffering, ridicule, and accusations, yet his trust in God remained. At times he questioned, but he did not curse God or try to manipulate his situation through his own defense. He waited in silence for God to speak. And when God finally revealed himself, Job's confidence was affirmed. God's justice was greater than any human explanation. His silence was not the silence of fear, but the silence of trust in the one who holds all answers. When you choose silence, you are saying to fear, you don't control me. You are saying to the enemy, I will not be baited into reacting in the flesh. You are saying to the world, I know a higher judge whose ruling cannot be overturned. That kind of confidence is unshakable because it is built on God's character, not on human fairness. Silence becomes a shield of faith that protects your heart from fear's lies and guards your mind from panic's deception. Fear thrives on noise. It feeds on arguments, on chaos, on desperate attempts to prove yourself. But silence starves fear. Silence breaks the cycle of panic and places you in the atmosphere of faith. In that stillness, you hear God's voice more clearly, you sense His presence more deeply, and you see His hand more powerfully. Silence is not the absence of courage, it is the evidence of it. It takes more courage to be silent than to react in fear, because silence requires complete trust in the unseen hand of God. When God's justice shows up, it always silences the critics. Those who mocked Daniel had to acknowledge the power of his God. Those who betrayed Joseph had to bow before him in Egypt. Those who crucified Jesus had to recognize that he rose from the grave. And in each case, silence was not weakness or fear. It was confidence that God's justice would prevail. And prevail it did in ways no human defense could have accomplished. So silence is not fear. It is faith in action. It is boldness wrapped in quietness. It is courage clothed in stillness. It is confidence that the God who sees in secret will reward openly, that the God who defends his children will never leave them exposed, and that the God of justice will always have the final word. Silence doesn't mean you're scared. It means you're secure. Silence is not ignorance. It is wisdom to let God handle what your hands cannot. Sometimes people assume that when you don't speak up, when you don't argue, or when you don't rush to defend yourself, it means you don't know what's going on. They believe silence equals ignorance, that your lack of response means you're unaware, unwise, or uninformed. But silence in faith is not a lack of awareness. It is the highest form of wisdom. It is knowing that just because you see the problem doesn't mean you have to solve it with your own words or your own strength. It is recognizing that some matters belong to God alone. And wisdom teaches you to step back so that his hand can do what yours never could. Wisdom is not always proven by how much you say, but by how much you can withhold. There are battles where your words will only add fuel to the fire. There are conflicts where your explanations won't change hardened hearts. There are situations where your best defense won't be enough to stop the accusations. Wisdom is knowing when to be silent, because silence gives room for God's wisdom to flow where your own understanding cannot. Proverbs tells us that even a fool is considered wise when he keeps silent. That's because silence often says more than words. Silence reveals restraint, patience, and discernment, all of which are rooted in wisdom. Think of Moses at the Red Sea. The people were panicking, crying out, complaining, and demanding answers. Yet Moses told them, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." That wasn't ignorance. It was wisdom. He understood that no human strategy could part the waters. No army could deliver them from Pharaoh's chariots. The only solution was divine intervention. And his silence in that moment demonstrated wisdom to wait on God's hand instead of trying to create his own escape. That same wisdom is available to us when we realize that our silence is not foolishness, but an act of faith that trusts the higher wisdom of God. Silence also protects you from saying things you can't take back. How many people have destroyed relationships, ruined opportunities, or damaged their own witness because they spoke in haste, out of anger or frustration? Silence is wisdom because it guards you from regret. When you hold your tongue, you give the Holy Spirit space to guide your thoughts and align your heart with God's truth before you act. You may not always know the right thing to say, but wisdom teaches you that sometimes the best response is no response. That silence isn't ignorance, it is maturity. Jesus himself embodied this wisdom. When he was falsely accused, he stood before Pilate and remained silent. He could have spoken words that would have changed the course of history in that moment. He could have argued his case with undeniable truth, but he chose silence because he knew that the will of God was unfolding through those accusations. That silence wasn't ignorance, it was divine wisdom to let the plan of salvation proceed without interference. His silence accomplished what no defense could ever achieve. And if the Son of God could remain silent with wisdom, then we too can learn the strength of holding our peace and trusting God's wisdom over our own. Silence becomes wisdom when you recognize the limits of your understanding. We live in a world that prides itself on knowledge, on having all the answers, on proving that you're right. But true wisdom is not about showing off what you know. It's about knowing when to let God's knowledge take over. Your silence is a declaration that His thoughts are higher than yours, His ways are greater than yours, and His wisdom far surpasses anything you could figure out. In silence, you acknowledge that you don't have to know everything because you trust the one who does. This is especially important when you are wronged. People will tempt you to argue, to defend, to fight back, but wisdom says, let God handle it, because when He handles it, He doesn't just deal with the surface, He addresses the root. He doesn't just fix the situation, He transforms hearts. He doesn't just clear your name, He uses your silence to display His glory. Ignorance tries to solve battles with noise, but wisdom trusts God to solve them with justice. And when His justice shows up, there is no question that it was His hand and not yours. Silence is not closing your eyes to the problem. It is opening your eyes to a greater reality, that God is sovereign, that He is working even when you don't speak, and that His wisdom is far more effective than your words. That's why silence is not ignorance. It is the wisdom of stepping aside and letting God fight battles you were never meant to fight. It is wisdom to know that not every attack deserves a response. Not every accusation requires a defense. Not every argument is worth your energy. Wisdom tells you to preserve your strength for the battles God has called you to fight while leaving the rest in His hands. So when you are tempted to speak out of anger, when you feel the pull to argue, when you're misunderstood and want to explain yourself, remember this: silence does not mean you don't know. Silence means you know better. It means you are wise enough to trust that God's justice, God's timing, and God's wisdom will do more than your words ever could. That kind of silence is not ignorance. It is divine insight wrapped in humility and faith. Silence is not defeat. It is victory that's still unfolding. Too often people equate silence with losing, as if the absence of your voice means the absence of your strength. They believe if you don't speak up, if you don't retaliate, if you don't prove yourself, then you have been beaten. But the truth is, silence is often the seedbed of the greatest victories. Just because you don't fight on human terms doesn't mean you've lost. It means you've shifted the battleground. Silence is not a sign that you've been overcome. It is the posture of someone who knows that God is still writing the story and the ending has already been determined in your favor. When the world looks at silence, it sees weakness. But when heaven looks at silence, it sees faith. Silence is trusting that what looks like loss is actually the setup for triumph. It is understanding that defeat is only final when you quit. But silence is never quitting. It is waiting. And waiting is not wasted time. Waiting is the ground where God grows the kind of victory you could never manufacture on your own. Sometimes silence is the only way to step out of the way so that God can show you that He doesn't just want you to win, He wants you to win His way. Think about Jesus on the cross. To His enemies, His silence looked like defeat. As He hung there, mocked and pierced, they thought they had silenced Him forever. But that silence was not the end. It was the preparation for resurrection. His silence was not weakness. It was victory in process. The greatest triumph in history was hidden in the silence of His suffering. That's what silence often looks like. Lost to the eyes of men, but victory to the eyes of God. What looks like a closed door, what feels like unanswered prayers, what seems like God's absence, is often His way of unfolding a victory that is bigger than anything you imagined. When you are silent in the face of opposition, you are declaring that the battle is not over. You are declaring that the outcome is not determined by what people say or do, but by what God has promised. Silence positions you to let victory unfold in God's timing. It says, I don't need to prove myself today because I know the victory is already secured tomorrow. It is faith that looks beyond the moment and sees the bigger picture. Joseph's life is another example of silence that looked like defeat, but was victory in disguise. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. Everything about his situation looked like loss. Yet Joseph didn't waste his energy fighting back with anger or bitterness. He endured in silence, and that silence was not defeat. It was God preparing him for elevation. When the time came, the very silence that carried him through prison positioned him to rule in the palace. What looked like defeat was actually victory unfolding in God's perfect plan. Silence also teaches us that victory is not always immediate. We live in a culture that craves instant results, quick justice, fast answers. But God's victories often unfold slowly, layer by layer, because He's not just working on the situation, He's working on us. In silence, He builds endurance. In silence, He grows patience. In silence, He deepens trust. And while it may look like nothing is happening, the unseen hand of God is orchestrating everything for your good. That's why silence is never defeat. It's the waiting room of victory. When you refuse to fight back in your own strength, you are declaring that your story doesn't end in shame. It doesn't end in loss. It doesn't end in failure. You are declaring that victory belongs to the Lord. And as long as He's fighting for you, defeat cannot hold you. Silence is faith that doesn't need instant gratification. It's confidence that even when you don't see the evidence of victory, it's already secured in the Spirit. There's also power in remembering that silence confuses the enemy. The devil thrives on your reaction. He wants you to panic, to argue, to retaliate, because in doing so you step onto his battleground. But silence robs him of his strategy. Silence frustrates him because it shows you're not fighting in your flesh. You're waiting on the Spirit. Silence says, I'm not playing by your rules. I'm waiting for God to reveal His victory in His time. And that kind of patience ensures that the enemy never gets the last word. Silence may look like defeat for a moment, but God always flips the script. The cross looked like the end, but the resurrection proved it was only the beginning. The pit looked like the end for Joseph, but the palace proved otherwise. The lion's den looked like the end for Daniel, but the morning light revealed a greater glory. Silence is never the end. It is the in-between space where God is shaping the testimony that will silence every critic and magnify His power. So when you are tempted to equate silence with defeat, remind yourself that you are not losing. You are waiting for the victory that is still unfolding. You are resting in the assurance that God never loses. And if He is your defender, you cannot either. Your silence is not the sound of loss. It is the sound of faith waiting for triumph. And when that triumph comes, it will be undeniable, unshackable, and unbreakable. Silence is not emptiness. It is filled with faith that heaven is at work behind the scenes. Many people misunderstand silence and assume it represents a void, as if nothing is happening when words are absent. They see silence as a vacuum, a blank space, a lifeless pause where progress stops. But in the kingdom of God, silence is never empty. It is full of unseen activity, divine orchestration, and spiritual movement. Silence may feel still on the surface, but underneath it is filled with power. It is like the seed buried in the soil, silent, unseen, yet sprouting roots and preparing to break forth. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means something greater is happening where human eyes cannot see. Faith thrives in silence because faith is about trusting what you cannot see. When you are silent in the face of a storm, it is not because you've given up, but because you believe heaven is already working. Silence is the evidence of an inner confidence that the invisible hand of God is moving. It is trusting that while you remain quiet, angels are being dispatched, hearts are being softened, lies are being exposed, and doors are being prepared to open. Silence is not an empty waiting room. It is a workshop of faith where heaven is crafting outcomes beyond your imagination. Consider Elijah on Mount Carmel. After the fire of God consumed the sacrifice, he prayed for rain. But instead of rushing or panicking, he sent his servant to look toward the sea again and again. For 6 times there was nothing, silence in the sky. To anyone watching, it looked like emptiness, like unanswered prayer. But Elijah knew the silence was full. He knew heaven was already stirring, preparing the clouds. On the 7th time, a small cloud appeared, and soon the downpour came. That silence was not empty. It was pregnant with promise. And the same is true for you. Your silence is not void. It is full of heaven's activity preparing your breakthrough. Silence also deepens your sensitivity to God. Noise drowns out His whispers, but silence makes room for His voice. It is often in your silent moments that you discern His direction more clearly, that you sense His presence more deeply, that you recognize His peace more tangibly. Silence is not emptiness, it is fullness. It is the fullness of God's Spirit quieting your anxieties and filling you with assurance. When you are silent before Him, you begin to see that what looked empty was actually overflowing with His presence. Look at the life of Esther. When she first entered the palace, she kept silent about her true identity. That silence was not emptiness. It was strategy. God was working behind the scenes to position her for such a time as this. And when the moment came, Her silence gave way to the right words that turned a death decree into deliverance for her people. Silence did not mean nothing was happening. It meant God was arranging every detail for victory. Silence is often misunderstood by others. People may think you are passive, uninterested, or unaware. They may even assume you lack conviction because you don't raise your voice in every battle. But silence is not the absence of passion. It is the presence of discipline. It is trusting God so deeply that you no longer feel the need to prove yourself with constant words. That trust fills the silence with meaning. Every quiet moment becomes an offering of faith, a declaration that says, God is at work even when I am not. The silence of God himself teaches us this truth. There are moments in our lives when heaven seems quiet, when prayers go unanswered, when situations linger longer than we'd like. In those moments, we may mistake silence for absence, but the truth is that God's silence is never empty. It is filled with unseen preparation. When Jesus lay in the tomb, heaven seemed silent. The disciples mourned, believing all was lost. But that silence was not empty. It was full of resurrection power building toward the third day. What looked like silence was actually the sound of victory about to burst forth. Silence requires faith because faith trusts what it cannot see. Faith believes that while you're waiting, God is working. Faith knows that while you're still, heaven is active. Faith refuses to measure progress by noise or movement, but rests in the assurance that God's unseen hand is accomplishing more in silence than human effort ever could in chaos. Silence is not emptiness. It is a container filled with trust, filled with patience, filled with expectation that heaven is moving even when you cannot. So when you find yourself in seasons of silence, don't mistake them for wasted time. Don't assume that nothing is happening because you can't hear or see it yet. Instead, recognize that silence is loaded with divine activity. The God who neither slumbers nor sleeps is always working, always defending, always orchestrating, even when you hear nothing. Silence is not empty. It is the invisible stage where God sets up his greatest displays of power. And when the silence breaks, it reveals the fullness that was always there, hidden until the right moment. There comes a point in every journey of faith where you realize that silence is not weakness. It is strength. It is not avoidance. It is alignment. And it is not defeat. It is positioning. When you learn to stay silent and let God defend you, you step into a level of trust that few ever experience. It is the kind of trust that says, I don't need to argue. I don't need to fight back. I don't need to prove myself because I know the one who holds the scales of justice and he will set them right. That kind of silence is not born out of fear, but out of courage. It takes far greater courage to stand still in the heat of the storm than to thrash about with your own strength. Life will always present moments when you feel compelled to defend yourself. The accusations, the lies, the misunderstandings, they sting deeply. Your natural instinct is to speak up, to clarify, to justify. But when you choose silence, you are choosing to hand the pen over to God and allow him to write your vindication. And the vindication he writes is always far greater than the story you could have written yourself. Human defense is temporary, but divine defense is permanent. Human justification can silence critics for a moment, but God's defense shuts mouths for good. Silence becomes your strongest testimony. People expect retaliation. They expect you to lash out, to fight, to respond in kind. When you don't, they are left wondering what gives you such peace. They see your restraint, but they cannot understand it. What they don't realize is that your silence is not empty. It is full of faith. It is a declaration that your God is alive, that he sees, that he knows, and that he will act on your behalf. Your silence becomes a sermon without words, a demonstration that says, I serve a God who fights for me. With the power of silence is not just in what it prevents you from saying, but in what it allows God to say. Silence creates space for his voice to be heard above the noise. It opens the door for him to speak on your behalf in ways you never could. He has the ability to turn the hearts of kings, to sway the minds of leaders, to expose the lies of enemies, and to elevate you in due season. Your silence becomes the canvas on which he paints his glory. Without your silence, his masterpiece could be obstructed by your own brushstrokes. Even when God seems silent, that silence is filled with meaning. You may pray and feel like the heavens are closed, like your cries are hitting the ceiling. But silence from God is not abandonment. It is preparation. Just because you cannot hear his voice does not mean his hand is not moving. When the disciples sat in fear between the crucifixion and the resurrection, they mistook silence for finality. But in the quiet of that tomb, heaven was setting the stage for the greatest victory in history. The silence was full of resurrection power, waiting for its appointed hour. When you embrace silence, you also embrace surrender. Silence says, I trust your timing, God. I trust your wisdom. I trust your justice. Silence releases the burden from your shoulders and places it squarely on His. That surrender becomes a place of peace. Instead of being consumed by anxiety and frustration, you find rest. Instead of striving to fix what you cannot fix, you stand still and watch the salvation of the Lord. That peace is not passive. It is active faith that allows you to live freely, even while battles rage around you. Every hero of faith understood this principle. Moses told the Israelites at the Red Sea to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Joshua marched silently around Jericho until God told them to shout. David refused to lift his hand against Saul, even when he had the chance, because he trusted God to deal with his enemies. Jesus himself, when accused falsely, often remained silent because his defense came not from words but from resurrection power. Over and over again, silence was not absence, it was assurance. Your silence is never wasted. It is a seed planted in the soil of trust, and in due time it will produce a harvest of vindication. You may not see it immediately, but the God who sees all will not let your silence go unrewarded. Every tear, every moment you chose not to retaliate, every prayer whispered in the quiet is being collected by heaven. And when the time comes, God will display your vindication in such a way that no one will doubt it came from Him. So when the temptation arises to defend yourself, pause. When the urge comes to argue, resist. When the pressure builds to prove your worth, remember who you belong to. Your silence is not weakness. It is worship. It is an act of faith that says, Lord, I trust you more than I trust myself. And in that faith, you will see the hand of God move. You will witness Him close the mouths of your accusers. You will watch Him turn the plans of the enemy upside down. And you will stand in awe as He lifts you higher than you ever imagined. Silence is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of God's story being revealed in your life. It is the moment when heaven leans in and begins to write chapters you could never write on your own. And when that story unfolds, it will be a testimony not just to you, but to everyone who sees it, that God is faithful, that He defends His children, and that He never fails those who trust Him enough to stay silent.